Listen carefully. From this moment on, you will understand why you choose the wrong people to be with, why you accept crumbs, why you chase after those who don't care, why you fall for people who give you nothing, and why you repeat the same relationship pattern, even knowing it will hurt. In this video, you will understand why your mind confuses love with effort, why you fear being alone, and why the emptiness that follows you pushes you back into toxic relationships that will never work. None of this started in adulthood. It started in childhood, in the type of love you received, or in the love that was missing. This is where you finally see the wound that shaped your relationships and how to break the cycle that has controlled your life until now. If you've ever found yourself repeating the same kind of relationship, even after promising yourself that next time will be different, there is nothing wrong with you. This is more common and deeper than it seems. There is an almost universal pain, knowing something will hurt and still feeling something stronger, pulling you in the wrong direction. You notice the signs, recognize the lack of reciprocity, understand that you are accepting far less than you deserve. But you cannot stop the movement. It's as if something inside you, we learned an emotional path. It does not know how to abandon. And this is exactly what you feel when you wonder why you can't escape this cycle. This feeling of seeing the disaster before it happens, yet still walking toward it, is not weakness, not excessive neediness, not a lack of emotional intelligence. It is emotional memory. It is the body reacting before the mind. You notice the absence, the coldness, the indifference, yet still feel an impulse to insist a little more. It's as if, even in the face of pain, there is a silent expectation that this time will be different. And that is why you repeat patterns, even knowing the consequences, because in your story, love was never simple. It was always tied to effort, fear, and waiting. The truth is, your idea of love doesn't begin when you fall in love for the first time. It begins when you learn to feel. Before you understood what affection was, your body was already absorbing the way it was treated. If you grew up without emotional comfort, without validation, without space to feel, a part of you internalized that love is unstable, tense, unpredictable, and as uncomfortable as it is to admit, that version of love becomes your reference point. That is why you insist on relationships that hurt, because they feel familiar, even if they destroy your emotional balance. Gabor Maté, physician and trauma specialist, deepens this idea by explaining that trauma is not just what happened to you, but who you had to become because of what happened. He shows how the mind creates emotional adaptations to survive the lack of care, adaptations that, in adulthood, become repetitive patterns, painful choices, and toxic relationships. Alice Miller, a psychologist known worldwide, adds to this by showing how a child who could not feel what they truly felt learns to love in order not to lose. The little affection they have, they grow up being strong, useful, pleasant, believing they must adjust to deserve love. Without realizing it, you inherited this movement. And when you put all this together, the emotional adaptation of childhood, the lack of validation, the constant effort to be accepted, you understand one of the hardest truths. Nothing begins in adulthood. Adulthood only repeats what childhood taught. You do not seek the wrong person. You seek the version of love your body learned as normal. You don't accept little because you want little. You accept it because you were trained to believe that this is all there is for you. And this is exactly where transformation begins. When you realize the story was never about luck in love, but about the emotional wounds that kept choosing for you, even when your mind begged for something better. When you try to answer, "What is love to me?" you may realize that this answer was not born in adulthood, but back when you were still learning to feel and express affection without understanding what was happening around you. From an early age, you needed emotional nurturing to develop, and this need is still valid today, including in self-love. If, in that initial phase, you were not seen, validated, or comforted, your body learned that the emotional field was unpredictable. That is where childhood wounds begin, wounds that shape emotional trauma and repetitive patterns. Alice Miller explained that a child interprets the lack of attention as personal failure, and this is precisely where the painful sense of insufficiency is born. You didn't understand that care was missing. You understood that times were missing. You may have grown up receiving affection only when you met expectations, when you were calm, polite, strong, or helpful. This unintentionally creates an internal model of conditional love. I only receive affection if I behave the right way. Gabor Maté showed that what hurts most is not what was done to you, but what was emotionally withheld. That is why love hurts so much today. Your body carries the memory of emotional oscillation and reacts as if affection could disappear at any moment. You grew up associating love with the tension of having to earn something that should be natural, and this mix makes you constantly question your own worth. Over time, this dynamic becomes an emotional pattern that activates without you noticing. I need to do more so I don't lose the person I love. And from this formula comes the confusion between affection and effort, between care and self-sacrifice. Miller noted that a child learns to hide their needs so they don't lose the little affection they receive. And you may have carried this into adulthood. That is why the question, "Why do I feel insufficient?" feels so hard to answer, because its origin is not recent, but an old adaptation that was never revisited. You try to love, but always with the feeling that you must give twice as much to receive half. This original wound creates an emotional model of love based on effort, fear, and scarcity. Effort to maintain connection, fear of not being enough, and a constant sense that something will always be missing. Maté showed that the body records these impressions as alerts, not as choices. That's why, when you love, your emotional system reacts before you even think. It's not being too sensitive. It's unprocessed emotional memory. Love hurts because it revives memories that never passed through consciousness, but were stored in the body. This influences everything: how you give yourself and the kind of relationship you tolerate. When you try to answer, "What is love to me?" you may notice the answer appears mixed with anxiety, expectation, and the feeling of always owing something. This happens because your internal model was not built from free affection, but from the attempt to avoid emotional abandonment. This pattern creates the impression that you need to times earn times love, not simply receive it. From this come traumatic bonds, emotional dependency, and the constant need for validation. But understanding this origin is not about blaming the past. It is about seeing how this emotional adaptation began. And it is exactly this adaptation that, in the next step, turns love into effort. When you try to understand why loving feels so demanding, you need to look at how you had to shape yourself in childhood. Alice Miller describes the well-adapted child as someone who learned to fit the expectations of adults, hiding emotions and needs to maintain affection, harmony, or safety. Perhaps you learned to be strong, well-behaved, or mature too early, because showing sadness or frustration wasn't welcomed. From this process is born that inner feeling that you must earn someone in order to be loved. Without noticing, you grew up believing that love depends on performance, not emotional truth. Gabor Maté emphasizes that trauma is often the version of you that had to emerge so you could continue belonging. And it's precisely from this point that the question appears that has followed you for years. Why do I accept crumbs? You accept crumbs because your body was conditioned to treat any small sign of affection as a privilege. In childhood, asking for more might have caused distance, irritation, or silence, so you learned not to ask at all. Today, when someone offers little, it doesn't scare you. In fact, it feels familiar. It's an old emotional scenario, repeated in new relationships. The same adaptation that once protected you creates another deep confusion. Why do I confuse affection with effort? Miller observed that the well-adapted child learns to guess the adult's moods, behave as expected, and shrink their own needs to avoid tension. This becomes habit. In adulthood, you feel you must prove, please, and earn, as if simply existing were not enough to receive love. When someone treats you well, without you having to move heaven and earth, it feels strange. When someone pulls away, you immediately blame yourself. This distortion comes from your emotional history, not from any lack of worth. Maté points out that the body seeks what is familiar, not what is healthy. That is why you find yourself repeating the same pattern, even while suffering. Difficult, unstable, tension-filled affection activates in you a kind of emotional recognition. As painful as it is, you know how to navigate this kind of love, because you always have. So when someone shows genuine interest, you feel discomfort, and when someone challenges you, ignores you, or offers little, an almost automatic impulse appears. Try just a little more. This impulse is not a choice. It is emotional memory. This emotional adaptation, which once served as a survival strategy, now becomes a weight that follows you into every relationship. You give more than you should. Try to anticipate needs. Put your desires aside and live afraid of disappointing others. That's how the feeling arises, that if you stop trying so hard, you'll be left behind. But the more you try to deserve love, the more you reinforce the belief that you are not worthy of receiving it freely. And at this point, a new and almost inevitable question arises. Why does your body keep seeking exactly the kind of love that exhausts you the most? When you ask yourself, why do I chase someone who doesn't care? The answer is not in your conscious will, but in the way your emotional system was programmed in childhood. Gabor Maté explains that the body learns emotional patterns before you learn words. If, in your story, love came mixed with insecurity, distance, or unpredictability, your body began to associate tension with connection. So when you meet someone emotionally distant, something inside you recognizes that pattern and pushes you to try to win them over. It's not a choice. It's emotional conditioning, activating without asking permission. The nervous system, as Maté emphasizes, seeks what it knows, not what is good for you. It's frightening to realize this, but also liberating. And it's from this point that another question arises. Why am I afraid of being alone? The fear doesn't come from solitude itself, but from what solitude awakens. Old emotional memories, tied to early emotional abandonment. When you're alone, the body accesses these implicit memories, that childlike discomfort, of having no one to rely on. The sensation isn't logical, it's physical. That's why being alone hurts more than insisting on someone who isn't available. This internal logic also explains why you connect more quickly with people who make you feel insecure than with those who offer stability. For your body, instability is familiar, stability is foreign. Alice Miller pointed out how the child who grew up trying to read the emotional climate of adults develops enormous sensitivity to the slightest sign of withdrawal. And it's this same pattern that traps you today in the emotional chase after someone who doesn't prioritize you. The insecurity you feel in these relationships triggers something old, not true love, but the echo of childhood trauma still seeking resolution. And from there arises another deep question. Why does love hurt in the body? Because for you, loving was never just a feeling. It was a physiological response, shaped by absence and emotional tension. When you love, your body doesn't activate only affection. It activates alarm. Your heart races, your stomach tightens, your breathing shifts. Maté explains that the body stores these memories in the muscles, in gestures, in the way it reacts to any sign of possible loss. Love hurts because your body learned that loving involves risk. And in your story, risk always meant fear of not being enough. This physiological conditioning creates an internal map that leads you to the same emotional places, chasing those who don't choose you, attaching yourself to what triggers anxiety, insisting on relationships that drain you, not because you don't know how to love, but because your body was trained in a version of love that always required effort. And as long as this programming remains unseen, you keep repeating old movements without noticing. But when you begin to understand these bodily responses, a new perception arises. Maybe you're not chasing love, but the attempt to repair a story that was never resolved. When you catch yourself thinking, "Why do I choose people who hurt me?" it's important to understand that this choice doesn't happen in the present. It happens in emotional memory. Gabor Maté highlights that childhood trauma creates an internal tendency that always guides you toward the familiar, even when the familiar hurts. If affection arrived mixed with distance, tension, or instability, your body seeks exactly that. In today's relationships, it's not that you want someone who hurts you. It's that this kind of bond activates an old emotional pattern you learned while trying to survive. Emotional abandonment. And it's exactly from this pattern that another question arises. Why do I fall in love with people who give me nothing? The emotional brain associates that lack of affection with the feeling of, I need to do something to earn love. Available people seem too simple, too light, almost strange, for someone who grew up having to fight to be noticed. Alice Miller explained that the child who learned to seek emotional validation develops enormous sensitivity to rejection. So when someone is indifferent, you feel an almost automatic impulse to prove your worth. This impulse is not passion. It's an attempt to resolve an old wound. Over time, this set of reactions creates a cycle you know well. You approach, wait, try, suffer, pull away, and then start again with someone identical, asking yourself, why do I always repeat the same pattern? The answer lies in the mechanism Maté describes as unconscious compulsion. The body tries to correct in the present what was not resolved in the past. You're not seeking pain. You're seeking the chance to finally be chosen by someone who emotionally resembles the figure who couldn't care for you. It's a healing attempt, disguised as attraction. This cycle works like an automatic emotional structure. The initial hope activates the reward. The effort rekindles childhood memory. The pain confirms the pattern, and the repetition reinforces the belief that you must earn every crumb of affection. Miller warned that the child who wasn't seen keeps trying to be seen into adulthood, only now through romantic relationships. That's why you insist on someone who doesn't choose you. Part of you believes that if you manage to win that person over, you will finally overcome the emotional abandonment that wounded you. But the body doesn't differentiate past and present. It only reacts to what it knows is less than number 0, 5 number is greater than, and so, without realizing it, you enter relationships that seem new, but follow the same old emotional logic. Available people don't awaken the same intensity because they don't activate your childhood wounds. They offer safety, but you were shaped in tension. Your body confuses stability with boredom and intensity with love. But this confusion isn't your fault. It's the result of years trying to repair stories that didn't begin in adulthood. And when you start to understand this pattern, a new question appears. How do you transform this cycle into something different? The answer begins in the next step, when you face the emptiness you've been trying to fill with love. When you try to understand, why do I accept anything? The answer begins in the emotional emptiness you've carried since early on. Gabor Maté explains that addiction is not about pleasure, but about relief, an attempt to silence a pain that was never seen. And in your case, love became exactly that, a form of emotional anesthesia. When someone gives you crumbs, your emotional hunger reacts as if it were a great offering. You don't accept little because you want little. You accept because something inside you is missing, and you try to compensate at any cost. This emptiness is not born in adulthood. It was created when you tried to handle pains that were far too big for your age. Maté emphasizes that when connection is fragile, the child develops mechanisms to cushion the pain, and these mechanisms, in adulthood, turn into repetitive patterns of self-sabotage. From this root comes the constant feeling of confusion, that question that follows you. Why does my love life feel like a mess? Because, without noticing, you try to organize internal chaos through the people you choose. And instead of healing, you find repetition. Toxic relationships enter this scenario like a kind of emotional medicine. They have intensity, highs and lows, drama, and all of this gives you a temporary sense of being alive. Alice Miller warned that when a child does not have their emotions welcomed, they grow up believing that love must come mixed with suffering. So when you get involved with someone who creates instability, a part of you feels momentary relief. The intensity fills the internal silence, but only for a moment. And that's when you mistake this for passion, when in reality, it's childhood trauma trying to make sense of itself. Emotional hunger, when not understood, becomes a distorted emotional radar. You get close too fast, give yourself too early, and create accelerated expectations, not because the person is special, but because you're trying to silence the pain you carry. And this is exactly where the deeper question appears. Why do I feel this emptiness? The emptiness is not the absence of someone. It's the absence of yourself. It's the accumulation of emotional abandonment, self-sabotage, validation never received, and self-love never cultivated. The body feels this gap as constant discomfort, and you try to fill it with any connection that appears. But none of this resolves the pain. It only distracts. The emptiness returns, the emotional hunger grows, and you enter cycles that seem different, but follow the same emotional structure. You accept anything, believe you must settle for little, and enter relationships that work more like relief than true connection. But this pattern starts to lose power when you understand what's behind it. An inner child trying to be seen. And it's exactly when this awareness awakens that the next step becomes possible, the real beginning of trauma healing. When you begin to look inward with honesty, a question arises almost on its own. How do I break the cycle? Gabor Maté emphasizes that healing begins when the pain is finally seen, not hidden, not rationalized, not avoided. And contrary to what many believe, healing is not erasing the past. It's understanding why. It still directs your choices. When you recognize that your repetitive patterns are not flaws, but old emotional responses, something inside you softens, the pressure decreases, the inner struggle loses strength. It is in this first relief that the healing process truly begins. Alice Miller observed that emotional transformation happens when you give voice back to the child who had to adapt in order to survive. And this leads you to the second question. How do I change my way of loving? You change when you stop demanding from yourself the same emotional adaptation you made in childhood. When you learn to validate your own feelings before seeking validation from others. When you understand that love is not earned, it is shared. This internal movement, simple but profound, begins to restructure your emotional identity. It is you giving yourself back the right to exist without constantly molding yourself. Healing also means relearning. Relearning to say, "This hurts me." Relearning to pause before diving in. Relearning not to chase after those who push you away. And in this process, another question appears, one you've been trying to answer for years. How do I start breaking patterns? You begin when you observe the impulse before acting, when you realize that the desire to insist on someone comes from childhood trauma, not from adult love. This awareness does not erase the pain, but it gives you choices, and choices are the beginning of the emotional freedom you did not have as a child. Maté reinforces that change only happens when you create new emotional experiences, not when you try to understand everything rationally. This means practicing small gestures, setting boundaries, receiving care without shrinking, choosing people who treat you with reciprocity. At first, the body will find it strange. After all, it was trained to confuse tension with connection. But every time you choose a healthy bond, you send a different message to your inner child. Now you are safe. And this signal begins to dismantle years of self-sabotage and toxic relationships. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. It happens when you stop looking in others for what was missing back then. When you understand that the love you seek begins within yourself, and for the first time, you realize that the most important question is not, "Why doesn't anyone choose me?" but, "Why haven't I fully chosen myself yet?" When this awareness arrives, the old model of love loses power. The cycle begins to unravel. And it is in this moment that a new path opens, the path where you stop being the child who had to adapt and become the adult who finally sets himself free. After understanding everything that drives your relationships, your childhood wounds, your emotional traumas, your repetitive patterns, that emptiness you tried to fill with love so many times, something begins to change inside you. Not magically, but consciously. For the first time, you can look at yourself without judgment. You understand that it wasn't bad luck. It wasn't too much neediness. It wasn't being too intense. They were old marks, governing present choices. And when you see that, you're no longer in the same place. You begin to reclaim something that has always belonged to you, the right to choose who you allow into your life. Now the question is no longer, why does this happen to me? But, what will you do with what you've learned? You can keep entering toxic relationships, accepting crumbs, trying to fix people who don't want to be healed, or you can begin to rebuild yourself, one step at a time. This is where Gabor Maté and Alice Miller meet. Both show that healing begins when you look at your pain with gentleness, not guilt. When you understand that loving is not repeating patterns, but learning new emotional paths. And that begins now, in your next decision. From here on, the change depends on you. Ask yourself, what can I do today, still today, to honor the inner child who had to be strong too early? Maybe it's setting a boundary. Maybe it's distancing yourself from someone who drags you down. Maybe it's choosing someone who offers reciprocity, even if that scares you more than it should. Or maybe it's choosing to be alone for a while, to learn to listen to yourself before seeking validation from someone who cannot give what you need. Adulthood does not fix the past, but it allows you to decide whether you will keep repeating or finally start freeing yourself. And now I give you back a question, the one that truly matters and can change your next step. Of everything you heard here, which emotional pattern do you feel ready to leave behind? Answer in the comments. This reflection is the beginning of your healing. And if this content made sense to you, like this video, subscribe and activate notifications so you don't miss what's coming. And if you want to continue this journey, the comments contain materials that go deeper into these themes to help you understand yourself better. And before you go, take this with you. One day, you will realize it wasn't love that hurt, but the attempt to receive from others what only you could have begun offering yourself. That is the moment when everything changes. That is the moment when you finally return to yourself.